Good morning, everyone. My name is Margaret Hinkle. I chair the Post Commission. Let me call our 28th public meeting to order. Let me start with determining who among the commissioners is in attendance in alphabetical order. Commissioner Bluestone.
Here.
Commissioner Calderon.
Here, good morning.
Commissioner Sherry.
Here, present.
Commissioner Ellison.
Here, good morning.
Commissioner Kazarosian.
Morning here.
Commissioner Luma.
Good morning, present.
Commissioner West.
Good morning, everyone. Present.
And Commissioner Wynn.
Good morning, present.
Thank you. And with that, we'll turn to the matters set forth in our agenda. The first item being the approval of the minutes of the August 4th meeting. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Is there a second to that motion?
A second.
Thank you. Commissioner Bluestone? I gather you approve. Commissioner Calderon?
Yes.
Commissioner Sherry?
Yes.
Commissioner Ellison?
Yes.
Commissioner Kazarosian?
Yes.
Commissioner Luma?
Yes.
Commissioner West?
Yes.
And Commissioner Wynn?
Yes.
I also approve. The minutes are unanimously approved. Let me move on next to the Executive Director report. As always, our Executive Director has been working extremely hard on behalf of the Post Commission. Over to you, please, Enrique.
Thank you, and good morning, Madam Chair and Commissioners. As has been customary for a couple of meetings now, let me share my screen to a PowerPoint presentation. It's only a few slides just to give you an overview of some of the activities that we've had since we last met as a commission. So give me a minute and to do that. Can everybody see this? As we've done in the last couple of meetings, just a brief update of some of the metrics for the certification effort of all individuals A through H. You will see not a lot of change in the total numbers since last August when I reported those numbers, but there has been some fluctuation within the categories as I had reported before. Notably, there's been more submissions since August 1st. The people, some departments that had extended, that we had extended the deadline. And you can see now in the bottom right of the screen here that the only pending department to submit to us information is the Boston Police Department, and that's the estimate of the roster that they have pending for us. Their deadline is September 15, and I have been in conversations with them, and they tell me they have made great progress. In the last few weeks, they have been in transition there with their leadership, but they expect to submit information to us very soon. We continue to deal with some of the conditionally certified individuals, and going to the next slide, the commissioners might remember that the first milestone that our plan for certification outlines is 90 days after the June 30th deadline. So we have September 30th coming up for some of the conditions that need to be met prior to that deadline. So we have begun to receive and process updates to those and information that pertains to updating those conditions. Notably, there are requirements about completion of basic or bridge training, as well as in-service training that has to be complied by June 30th of the year, but agencies have 90 days to submit all of that information to the MPTC, who in turn provides us with that information for us to remove that condition or investigate further. We have also been sending correction letters, as I have reported before. There are now 10 individuals who did not complete the Breach Academy. And after the review of all of the records, all of the training records of the NPTC and our own records, we have essentially filtered out people who have not met that requirement and can go either have to go get a full academy training or cannot be certified. We have also identified 2 individuals listed in the National Decertification Index, and we've sent them a letter to that effect. I can report that they want us to review their case further, and I may be back to you with more updates on that at a future meeting. Just briefly, our certification of new graduates continues to date, or rather since December 1st, when we started certifying individuals graduating from academies. There's now 598 individuals there. There's 107 of those. Almost 600 people are special state police officers. There's also 2 additional classes graduating this month, and that represents about 50 cadets. And just looking ahead, the Boston Police Department and the State Police will graduate approximately 300 officers in October. So that continues to keep us busy in terms of ensuring that the requirements that the statute sets forth and the forms that we require are submitted to us prior to them graduating from the academies, so that everybody can start without any interruptions right after they graduate. Also associated with the certification, we have begun the implementation of our permanent solution, the technology platform that's in Salesforce. We have executed the first task order with our consultant Slalom, and that is for a duration of 8 weeks and $363,000. We are, as we speak, designing the requirements for what they term to be the MVP, or the minimum viable product. And all of that, the methodology that we're doing, which is a best practice in the technology contracting these days, is issue small, short task orders that we are all in agreement, and therefore we have executed the one for 8 weeks to determine how much, what time frame and scope we're going to have, and we'll continue to do that subsequently. As a result, the scope and the budget of that big project is still fluctuating. We'll get into a little bit more of that in the finance part, but we are very cognizant that we manage to the budget, and we want to get as much functionality as needed as possible, because we clearly have identified all those needs, and that's, I guess, part of the discussions of this first phase. I would also mention that we continue to have some solutioning on the interim solution, the JIRA process. We've begun taking steps to have an after action report in order to update the forms and the intake process as we contemplate the next wave of recertification rather, individuals with last names I through P. Even though that seems far away, June 30th of next year, we want to make sure that we give ourselves a lot more time this time around to review all those submissions. That means at least a couple of months. We want to make sure that agencies have a little bit more time, like they did before, to make those submissions to us. And that means that we need to continue solutioning that process in the next few months, because again, the process will continue. Let me turn it over to Eric Rebello-Pradas, who is our CFO. He can speak to the slide before you. And he can also answer some questions, and I can also answer any questions you may have shortly. So, Eric, are you available?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Enrique. There was a memo that was included in your packet that was delivered, which gives much more detail than the slide. We're just taking a few highlights out of that here so that we can present to you and answer any questions you may have after reviewing that. And of course, we'll always be available for that after the commission meeting as well. So just starting out, we finished FY22, which ended June 30th, the fiscal year, spending about $2 million out of our $4.9 million budget. So that leaves a balance of $2.9 million that we're able to, or would be available to balance forward into FY23. We spoke about this numerous times, that amount of money would be used for our IT solution, which is the Salesforce that Enrique was discussing a little bit earlier. The good news about this is that due to some estimates from TSS that ended up being a lot less than they had previously calculated, we ended up pulling in an additional $200,000 less spending last year, which equals more of a balance this year. So we were originally predicting 2.7 million for the rollover, but now it'll be about 2.9. And I'm happy to report too that the governor has included this in his final deficiency supplemental budget, which was filed on August 31st. Now it just has to make its way through the legislature. Spending plans were due yesterday to A&F. By law, we are required as a state entity to submit a spending plan. It does not need to be approved by A&F, but we have to at least show them some type of a plan. This is very, very much in line with what the commission had voted on June 30th. The only difference would be is that because there's so much time that expires or transpires between January when the budget is filed and July when it's finally signed into law, there's a lot of updates that can happen along that time, especially with employment, payroll, and IT and so forth. Plus, the legislature sometimes throws in a lot of items too in the budget that were not initially calculated when the governor's budget came out in January. So spending plans is basically a way to sort of corral all those variations with a plan to A&F on how we're going to spend those. A perfect example is that extra $200,000 in rollover funds that we are going to put towards the Salesforce IT solution. We'll have more detail when we do our first quarterly update with the commission, which will be in October. The next phase of the budget cycle after spending plans is FY24 development. Maintenance requests will go up to A&F sometime in October, and then after that, there'll be a what they call expansionary or plans will go up sometime in November before Thanksgiving. So we'll be talking to the commission, to you a lot about these as the next weeks move on. Contracts update, just real quick. We finished the procurement with for the outside legal counsel. So the winner ended up being Anderson Krieger. So we are in the midst right now of developing a 1-year contract, an as-needed contract with that firm. Also, we had, as Enrique had alluded to, we had just finished putting together the statement of work. Very, very long process, very long procurement, also very extensive negotiations with Slalom and Smartronics. So we did put together a contract for $363,000, as Enrique said, will get us through till about mid-October. For our hiring, happy to report that over the next few weeks, especially starting next week, we're going to be onboarding 4 new employees for the Division of Standards, 2 enforcement counsels, 1 compliance agent, and 1 paralegal. This will bring the total amount of staff for post to 22. We are on target to get to 27, as we had predicted earlier in June, by the end of 2023, or the end of the fiscal year 23. Also, in terms of HR, we have completely incorporated our background check process in-house. We no longer need to rely on the governor's office or HRD to help facilitate these. This will save us lots of time, literally weeks, days on end, in putting together our own process and our own system. So we have access to Decigus as well as other subscriptions. And we have in-house staff that is trained to utilize utilize these resources so that we can conduct our own checks. So we'll be able to do background checks in literally hours as opposed to waiting on days. So this will save us a lot of time and energy. And then finally, just the annual report. We are in the midst of putting this together right now. All of the departments, including finance and administration, of course, we had decided that as with most annual reports throughout the state government, they all seem to coincide with fiscal year. And that always seems to make a lot of sense because once the fiscal year ends, your spending ends for that year. And that's a good time to sort of go back and review what you did for the prior 12 months. So what we decided was that June 30th, 2022, we would end on the fiscal year. We'd wait for the accounts payable period. That's July and August, where we get to basically last minute bill payments and shoring up any type of finances we have for the prior fiscal year. And then we would file the report sometime. Ideally, it would be the end of September, which most state agencies file their annual reports. The first one, though, it might be a little bit later than that, as this will be our first one. And obviously, there'll be quite a bit of information that's going in there. What's really nice about this timeline, though, too, is that the first budget, the FY23 budget that we just passed has some reporting information that was included in a line item, our line item for FY23, and it's due in March. But we have up till March to present that information. What's really good is we can kill two birds with one stone. We can get the annual report out of the way, and then we can actually have the reporting that line item language was asking for. We can include that within the annual report as well. So this way we can get two things out of the way with one thrust. Thank you, Enrique.
Yeah, I think that concludes the slide deck, commissioners. We're happy to take any questions that the commissioners may have.
I think.
I had a couple of.
Mr. Ellison.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I had a couple of questions. One, Eric, just on the staffing, how many of those employees out of the 22 currently are full-time, and are any of those part-time employees?
Thank you, Commissioner Ellison. Yes, out of the 22, 5 are considered part-time. They are post-retirement employees, so therefore they are limited by law on the number of hours that they can work per calendar year. However, I will note that the legislature did waive that cap for calendar year 2022. So it won't go back into effect until next calendar year.
Okay, thank you. And one quick question for Enrique. On the cases that you have that you further review, how many of them would you say or estimate would need further review from the commissioners? Or do you have a number currently?
You know, Commissioner, the short answer is I don't know. We are very much making sure that that we're studying those carefully. We're documenting a protocol for that review, which we feel is very important, and we hope to bring you a better update on those numbers fairly soon. I can say this of what has happened. That number started with approximately 60 or so people, and again fluctuated because there were more people that submitted and so on. And we've brought that down to 50 currently. So we felt that some individuals that have not been attested to for the reasons that they gave as our regulations provide, that those were not necessarily what we intended. To be reviewed by commissioners. But of course, by definition, that means that the harder that judgment call gets as we go further down that list, the more likely that they will come before you or a subset of you.
So just one follow-up to that. So currently, they're still able to operate in their former capacity with their full police powers from their agencies, is that correct?
That's correct. Everybody, even if they're under further review, they are conditionally certified, conditioned on that review. Our regulations do not state a deadline for our review, and that's by design. But of course, we do not want to take so long that we get into the next year, for example, because we have to anticipate that there's going to be a number of individuals in potentially the same category once we get submissions from I through P. So we're working on making our way through those cases, in the next few weeks and months.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Any other questions or comments from my fellow commissioners on either Enrique or Eric's report? Don't think I see any hands in the air. Let me express great gratitude, Enrique, Eric, and those who have worked with you in what has been accomplished and is set forth in your respective reports. We are very grateful for the information that you've provided to us. And I think with that, let me move on to our general counsel update. We are going to begin with item number 4E today in the agenda, designated as joint guidance as to chapter 123, section 12, and the use of force. So over to you, please, Randy.
Thank you. I'm having a little trouble screen sharing, so I'll ask Maurice if you wouldn't mind to open up the document that's labeled 1A, section 12 guidance. I'm referring to a document that I had sent.
All right, give me one moment, please.
Sure.
Can you give me which regulation specifically, please, Randy?
All right, it's a document entitled 1A, section 12 guidance of 09/07/22.
All right, give me one moment here. You didn't. Excuse me. All right, 1A. Second here. Randy, I'm not seeing that particular, based on what you sent over, sir.
All right, let me.
So, Randy, I can share from the public, from the folder or from the packet. Do you have a preference?
Let me try one other approach. See if this will work. No. All right. All right. Are you now seeing this document?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry for that. This is a version of the guidance regarding chapter 123, section 12, and the use of force that the commission viewed previously, but a few changes have been made in response to comments that were offered at the last meeting. And again, in general, this guidance is intended to provide some clarification in response to questions that were raised about whether there is any tension between the requirements of section 12 and the use of force regulations that were promulgated jointly by the MPTC and the commission. And the guidance, generally speaking, is intended to explain that there is no tension and to clarify how the two work together in a few limited ways. So I'll first show the ways that this guidance has changed since the last meeting. The first way is simply that it adds citations to the post-commission's own version of the regulations. There was a point in time when the regulations were housed only under a title of the Code of Massachusetts Regulations reserved to the MPTC. Since then, the commission has received its own title, Title 555. And so the regulations are now housed there as well. So this, in each instance, adds a citation to the corresponding version of the commission's own regulations. The second way in which a change was made is that the last paragraph was struck. And as you might recall, there were questions raised about whether the phrase such non-deadly force could be construed to say that an officer can only use non-deadly force and cannot use deadly force, even if the circumstances and the regulations would warrant the use of deadly force. And that was not what was intended. But then when we attempted to reframe things by using phrases such as such force that is deemed to be both necessary and proportionate, then that raised concerns about whether it could be construed to mean that an officer has the option to decide whether to use deadly or non-deadly force without any limitations, and that wasn't intended either. But ultimately, this paragraph essentially reaffirms things that are already stated in the guidance. So it seemed like the best course of action was just to strike that final paragraph and thus avoid, as it states in the margin comment, the first risk that I mentioned about the phrase such non-deadly force, as well as any risk that could be created with a substitute phrase, like just stating such force. But again, it does not detract from the main messages that this guidance is intended to send. And with that, I'll just turn to what those messages are, because I have gotten the sense from some comments outside the meeting that there may be some misunderstandings about what was intended here. And this guidance is intended just to provide a few limited forms of clarification. So one is that it states that none of the sources listed, meaning Section 12, Chapter 6E of the general laws, the session law from 2020, or the regulations, that none of these sources prohibits officers from using force in Section 12 situations where the regulatory standard is met. It also states that where officers do have a duty under Section 12, that those other sources do not relieve them of that duty when there's a likelihood of serious harm only to the person at issue and not to the public. It then states that the regulations do not allow officers to substitute their judgment for that of mental health professionals after a determination is made under Section 12. So the regulation does not give them some new ability to do that. It's equally important, I think, to emphasize what this guidance does not do. The regulations contain certain provisions about attempting de-escalation before using force. This guidance does not relax those obligations or any other obligations officers have, or it does not grant them any new powers that they did not have. At the same time, it does not impose any new duty on officers with respect to Section 12 or mental health situations that they do not have under the law, or any new limitations on their ability to make determinations about the use of force on the scene. Again, no new limitations. There are, of course, limitations in the regulations themselves, but this does not create any new restrictions in that way. We've heard some comments that were essentially critical of the Section 12 scheme, and that other comments that there's much more that can be said about these sensitive situations and much more guidance that could be given to officers. And of course there is, and I don't mean to minimize any of those comments that we've received on either side, but this is not attempting to rework the Section 12 system, nor could it rework Section 12. That's for the legislature. And it also does not, it's not intended to provide comprehensive directions on Section 12's implementation and mental health situations. There is, of course, plenty that could be said on that subject, and it would need to be handled very carefully. This does not attempt to try and provide any kind of comprehensive guidelines to officers on how to handle those difficult situations. It was just intended to serve certain limited purposes. So I hope that is helpful. And with that, I'll stop the screen sharing.
And let me now ask the commissioners to comment and question to the extent that they have either. But if I could begin with Commissioner Bluestone, because I think she has been instrumental in the development of the guidance and has discussed it with us on various occasions previously. And then I will take up questions from the other of the commissioners and perhaps also from Attorney Povich, who's worked, I know, on this issue carefully with our general counsel. Commissioner Bluestone, please.
Thank you, Chair Hinkle, and thank you, Attorney Ravitz. I think the work that you've done on this is excellent, and it is, as you point out, slightly complicated. If you'll indulge me, I'd just like to make a few comments which are reiterating some of what you said, but really coming more from my perspective as a mental health professional. And I would just like to sort of describe a little bit more of the history of this issue as it's come before us. We've had many discussions over the past 6 months or more with various stakeholders about Section 12A and Section 12E transports by law enforcement, and how the use of force regulations apply in these situations. And I think that we've sort of come to the conclusion that we're really trying to provide clarification that when we developed the regulations, we took into consideration these civil situations where law enforcement may be involved in going out to assist in transporting a person who's been deemed to have a mental illness, a serious mental illness, and some significant risk of harm either to themselves or to others to a hospital for the purposes of evaluation. And we recognize that these are sometimes complex and volatile situations. I reviewed carefully the letter from my colleagues at the Massachusetts Association for Mental Health in their letter dated August 31st, 2022. And they express concerns that I think those of us in the mental health field all share. And they state in their letter that, quote, that this is quote, a debate and discussion about the role of law enforcement in situations that arise pursuant to Section 12. And I would just take the position personally that we are not in this circumstance discussing the role of law enforcement in the Section 12A or 12E process. We are simply clarifying that our use of force regulations apply in these cases, and recognizing that there is a current law that describes what the role of law enforcement currently is in a 12E or a 12A transport situation. And I would also like to just say that both myself and I think all of us, all of my fellow commissioners are aware of the concerns about people with serious mental illnesses and the fact that they are at significantly increased risk for experiencing encounters with law enforcement where there is use of force and sometimes injury related to those encounters. And the point that the association makes that the risk is several times higher for people with serious mental illness than it is for even various ethnic and racial groups is, I think, something that we also all understand. And as a psychologist with spending most of my career working for the Department of Mental Health, I care deeply about this issue, and it's certainly tempting to sort of expand more on how we think law enforcement should engage when we identify that a person does have a mental illness. However, I would just point out that in the Acts of 2022, Chapter 253, Section 106, the legislator says that there shall be, pursuant to Section 2A of Chapter 4 of the general laws, a special legislative commission on emergency hospitalizations. And it really is my opinion that it is not our role as the post commission to take up this issue, that this is a very complex issue. What the role of law enforcement should be in these situations is a complex issue. And we look forward to further guidance from the commission that is going to dedicate their attention to this issue as we go forward. And also, lastly, I would just reiterate Commissioner Luma's statements and concerns in the last meeting, that this, in my view, is also really a training issue, and that there are lots of efforts underway to ensure that law enforcement are being better trained and have a full range of options available to them, including partnerships with mental health professionals when they are engaging with individuals in the community who have serious mental illnesses, and would encourage us to in this particular case, think about keeping it simple and just offering the guidance to support the law enforcement officers out there who are already, in my view, doing quite a good job in this area.
Thank you, Commissioner Bluestone. Commissioner Wynn, please.
Thank you, Chair. No question, just additional thank you to Attorney Ravitz and his team and Attorney Povich and his team for the work on this. And I'll keep this brief, just to reiterate something that my fellow commissioner just said and that Attorney Ravitz referenced. The purpose of this guidance was limited to kind of balance where we sit within the existing framework of the legislation that we lived with for most of my career and the legislation that we're entrusted with enacting. And if there needs to be a look at the overall framework of Section 12, which I think we would all agree there does, that's on the legislature. And law enforcement has been requesting that for years. So I agree with Commissioner Bluestone, that's not our role. We need to give some immediate guidance to balance the existing requirements of Section 12 with the use of force regulations so that officers know what's expected of them.
And thank you, Commissioner Wynn. Commissioner Calderon, please. Larry, we can't hear you, Larry.
You show you're not muted, but we can't hear you.
I think he just left. Maybe he'll come back.
Any other commission, while we wait for him to get back on, do any other commissioners have any questions or comments while we're waiting for Commissioner Calderon?
How about now, Madam Chair? Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
All right, little glitch. At least we learned how to do that. We just log out and log back in. So what I was saying is that I agree with the mental health professional organization's letter and Commissioner Bluestone. But I want to express the grave concern just on the guidance that we did put out here. Officers on the street have a different view than the guidance letter that we're putting out. Specifically, we're making the point that officers cannot substitute their own judgment on the scene. And I think what might be missing from the rank and file's opinion is what actually happens on a scene. When we get there, there's a lot more going on, whether it's the individual that's affected just by the uniform officer's presence, which we know happens, all the way to the fact that maybe at the time that an individual applied for the Section 12, the person in question may have been in a different state of mind. And then when police officers get on the scene, Larry Calderon is perfectly calm, friendly, and doesn't appear to be in any need of help. And many times what happens is, at least if we're going to follow this guidance, we must take them. That escalates the situation. That creates more tension. That then makes the job of the police officers on scene much more difficult. And the utilization of force that we're trying to control by making a uniform decision or answer is inadequate. And I know we're doing the best that we can. Maybe some rank and file officers need to be involved in the conversations that are happening with our commission and the MPTC. Maybe some street police officers, respectfully to my coworkers that are on the screen with me and on the commission, some people that are answering those calls for service daily on the street, as opposed to us who are sitting down and trying to form better guidance on the regulations and the law that exist. So in short, I think we still have a lot of work to do to give more appropriate and better guidance to the rank and file on the street, because these interactions that are happening across the Commonwealth daily could result in a death of a person that doesn't need to be done. So it doesn't need to happen, if I could say it that way. My apologies. So I'm very concerned about it, and I'm trying to find the right words to express it without offending naturally my colleagues in the commission or anybody in the MPTC. But there is some grave concern, because I've been asked for the last couple of days now by multiple departments in the policy group, hey, were you sitting on this? Well, what police officers were there? Do they really understand what's going on when two officers go to the door? And those are all good questions and good points. So I ask everybody to take that in consideration on the behalf of the people I represent. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Calderon. Let me just comment very briefly before I turn to Commissioner Ellison. I think this is at least the third time that we have addressed the guidance at the commission level. We have invited comments with regard to members of the public who have had any interest in this, and those comments I know have been taken into consideration as this has evolved within the commission. Let me also state that this is guidance that we will promulgate. Guidance can be adjusted as things develop, and the commission can take up further developments on guidance and will do that also. Again, thank you for your comments, and let me now turn to Commissioner Ellison, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Bluestone, for your work on this. Now, I just want to follow up somewhat on what Commissioner Calderon was saying, is that most instances, actually all, as a precautionary measure, our medical personnel or anyone doing the evaluation will not enter without law enforcement. And as Commissioner Calderon stated, that sometimes escalates people's anxiety or whatever. If we're not going to see how we can maybe have those folks address this, and we stage a little back from it and there if we're needed, but our presence is always the first most of the time that the people encounter, because these other folks who are there to assist, EMS or whoever, will not go in without a police presence. So there's always going to be that issue of law enforcement being there. And a lot of times it's not necessary, it's just as a precaution.
And thank you, Commissioner Ellison, for your comments as well. Commissioner Luma, please.
Yeah, and just in response to my fellow commissioners, I understand the concerns of officers who are, enacting and participating in transporting individuals who may be experiencing mental health crisis. I also kind of agree with Commissioner Bluestone that some of what we're discussing is beyond the scope of this commission. And I do believe that it requires, I think, to reiterate what Commissioner Nguyen said, the legislature to kind of tackle this issue, but also to reiterate, it comes down to a training issue that I think has to involve police officers, mental health professionals in order to make those determinations. I do not think that as the regulation states, that officers should supersede the judgment of mental health professionals. I think there needs to be some collaboration. But I think it's just beyond the scope of this commission, but it's a much needed discussion as we think about moving forward on Section 12. Thank you.
And thank you, Commissioner Luma. Back to Commissioner Calderon, please.
Thanks again for the opportunity to speak. Commissioner Luma, great point. And again, I agree with you. I think it's well beyond what we can do as a commission. There should be a special legislative body put together, at least according to the law. And I know that Commissioner Bluestone also spoke about that. But I wanted to push the idea that I know is happening around the Commonwealth, and maybe we can add some weight to it as these conversations continue. But a multi-professional response on a Section 12 is probably in the best interest of the person that we're going to serve the order on. That being EMS and a mental health professional. There should be a team going to that door. It shouldn't be incumbent on the police officers only that need to de-escalate, that need to take into consider their observations at the time, the mental well-being of the patient at the time. There are a lot of different factors there that should not fall on the rank and file police officer only, especially if they have no capability of making a judgment call on the scene. If we're taking that out of the hands of the officer for whatever reason that we can discuss, maybe we should be pushing and looking at a tri-response, EMS and mental health professional when these orders are being served. And Madam Chair, I do thank you. I did submit not only the BPD's Section 12 policy, but any of the groups within the policy group. We did submit to this commission, so I wanted to make sure that I backed you up on that. That is correct. We did solicit people's opinions, and whatever I did receive, I did forward to our commission. So I just want to make sure that the people in the audience know that their voice was heard, and you are correct. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Bluestone, I think your hand was up next, and then Commissioner Wynn, please.
I just wanted to respond, Commissioner Calderon. I think you make good points, and I think we're all concerned both about the safety of officers and other first responders who enter into those situations, as well as the safety of people with serious mental illness. And these are very complex situations. But I think just going back to the issue of law enforcement substituting their judgment for the judgment of a mental health professional, I think that the issue is clear if you read the law, that the law states that it is the mental health professional who can make this determination. And in the absence of a mental health professional, it can be a police officer if a person needs to be transported for evaluation. And I think that we're just asking law enforcement officers to follow the law. So, and also letting them know that in these situations, we recognize the complexity and we support them in using the regulations as they've been as they've been determined. So I think it's a simple issue, and the issues that you raise are definitely important to take up. And if there are groups that don't like the way it's currently working, I would say that the option is to change the law.
Thank you, Commissioner Bluestone, and Commissioner Wynn, please.
I just wanted to respond to Commissioner Calderon, because Commissioner, I agree with you completely. In a perfect world, that would be the multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional response. But I also have to point out that we have the authority to issue guidance for the entire Commonwealth. And that includes the communities that surround me, where there's part-time ambulance services and no mental health provider. And the only person available to go on these calls is a police officer. And we've got to thread the needle between what's possible in Boston and what's possible in Beckett.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from my fellow commissioners? I don't think I see any hands in the air. I think with this, I would call for a vote on our guidance. Is there a motion to that effect?
I move, so moved.
I'm sorry, I don't know where that voice came from.
It's from Marcia Kesrogen.
Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Second.
And I think it's seconded both by Commissioner Wynn and by Commissioner Luma. Thank you. Any further comment or questions? If not, Commissioner Bluestone, please, your vote.
I approve.
Commissioner Calderon,
No, I disagree.
Commissioner Sherry,
I approve.
Commissioner Ellison.
Approved.
I'm sorry.
Approved.
Thank you. Commissioner Kesrogen,
Approve.
Commissioner Luma,
Approved.
Commissioner West,
Approved.
Commissioner. I think the recording stopped momentarily. I'm going to start. Commissioner West, did we get your vote, please?
Approved.
And Commissioner Wynn,
Approved.
and I also approve. So by a vote of 8-1, the guidance is approved. Let me again thank everyone who has worked on this guidance and every member of the commission who has participated in a full discussion of the issues that it raises. Let me also thank our general counsel and our outside counsel for the work that they've done with regard to the guidance. Let me now turn, please, to on the agenda. It is item 4A, draft regulations on databases and dissemination of information. Randy, over to you again, please.
Thank you. Okay, you should now be seeing the draft regulations. This is the version that I used in the last meeting, which contains some margin comments, explanatory comments, as well as some endnotes. And I had, at a request from one of the commissioners, I forwarded that to the commissioners. But this version includes some revisions. And if you excuse me for just a moment. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, it's not showing what I expected it to show.
Randy, do you want me to share what's in the
Yes,
packet?
that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, give me a minute. I had the packet open. Okay, let me share
Sorry.
just one more minute. Here we go. Can you all see this? Is this, I don't think this one has the comments, Randy, but this has the.
No, that's all right. So yes, if you wouldn't mind scrolling down, this version shows redlining from the last version that reflects the changes made to the document since the last meeting. And a number of the changes refer to a regulation 555 CMR 8.00. And the purpose of those changes is to take into account a set of regulations promulgated by the Executive Office of Administration and Finance under the Fair Information Practices Act. And as I had discussed last time, the Fair Information Practices Act is an act that provides among other things, certain restrictions on the dissemination and the handling of information that refers to an individual, any individual, where that information is not a public record, it's not Corey, it's not within certain other categories. And the statute requires regulations to be promulgated by the Executive Office of Administration and Finance for any agency that is not within an executive office, such as ours. So at the moment, we are governed by those regulations. However, the regulations themselves state that they essentially they apply unless such an independent agency promulgates its own regulations under the Act. So there were certain additions made to these draft regulations in order to make clear that they are, in addition to serving other purposes, they serve as the Commission's own regulations under that statute. And so therefore, it's a way for the Commission to basically take control over its own regulations within that area, as opposed to leaving another agency that it does not normally report to with the ability to regulate how the Commission handles that information. So that's the first major area of change. If you wouldn't mind scrolling down more. This next addition is simple. It's there to account for the fact that the executive director might delegate certain functions that are assigned to the executive director in these regulations to another individual. And so this would provide that wherever the term executive director appears, it would apply to that person or that person's designee. Scroll down. Thank you. Now, this next section, this is the section that spells out the parameters of the public database and exactly what would be included within the public database. And there are certain additions that were made to provide for, to clarify the range of information that would be included. So here you can see that what was added would ensure that the information included is not only information pertaining to officers who are certified fully, but also officers who are conditionally certified or whose certifications are pending or have been restricted or limited, or officers who have not been recertified. So information regarding those officers would be included in the database. Down below, you can see the phrase "a vote of the commissioners" is just there for clarification. But the word "active officer" was added under section 4A to make clear that this is referring to serving officers. If you wouldn't mind scrolling down. The next addition is an exclusion, an exception from the provision that would provide for the summary of officer disciplinary records to be included. And this exception applies to unsustained or unfounded complaints. So in other words, those types of complaints would not be included. Next, under the subsection that provides for that the database should allow for ways to aggregate data, in other words, for members of the public to compile data, it adds another category that they should have the ability to compile or aggregate the total number of complaints that were reportable. If you could scroll down, please. Thank you. And again, these are just more changes consistent with the idea that that these regulations would now be superseding 801 CMR 3.00. It's the same type of change. Next, this change under subsection D was intended to account for a situation where a matter, even if it is no longer being investigated or adjudicated by the commission, is still being investigated or adjudicated by another matter. It would include that type of matter, that type of situation within the scope of what is ongoing, what is considered an open matter. So when the exemptions under the public records law are applied, and we consider whether a matter is ongoing, it would encompass matters that the commission knows are being investigated or are subject to disciplinary or legal action by another body. That's just a phrasing change. That's just another change to reflect the fact that we would now be superseding 801 CMR 3.00. This section is largely new, and it is intended to account for certain comments that were made at the last meeting about the extent to which the regulations would give officers the opportunity to correct data that was incorrect or to otherwise object to data that's included in the database. And if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Director, scrolling down just a little bit to the part that was struck. Okay, right there. Initially, this provision provided that if there's a challenge made to personal data, which again, that's a term of art that's used under the Fair Information Practices Act, and it applied to data that is not public record, that's not CORI, but that refers to a particular individual, that if a challenge was made to that data, it would be governed by those ANF regulations that I mentioned a moment ago, 801 CMR 3.04. This replaces that section with something more extensive, something that's broader for a couple of reasons. One reason is the one that I mentioned earlier, that these regulations are intended to supersede those ANF regulations and basically reclaim an ability by the commission to promulgate its own regulations within this area. So it does not refer to those regulations and incorporate those, but it also goes beyond the scope of those regulations. It borrows from the system that they create for challenging, again, that type of personal data, but it extends more broadly to data that is not just so-called personal data under the Fair Information Practices Act. So in other words, also data that would be a matter of public record, data that would be CORI. And it takes the mechanism that was provided in those regulations and gives officers the ability to challenge that broader range of information, of data. And if you wouldn't mind scrolling up. Thank you. So what it states is that objections can be raised to the accuracy, the completeness, the pertinence, the timeliness, the relevance, or the dissemination of the data. That phrasing, by the way, is largely drawn from the Fair Information Practices Act. But again, this would apply to a broader range of data. And it allows somebody to raise a challenge by filing a written petition to the executive director at any time. It provides for the executive director to properly evaluate that, to obtain relevant information if necessary, and then to properly take steps. If the complaint is valid, if the commissioner, if the executive director finds that a change is warranted, the regulations provide that change should be made. But if the executive director disagrees and finds that the change should not be warranted, the executive director would then notify that person and allow that person to submit a statement that essentially voices the objections, that expresses disagreement. And then that statement would need to be included with the data and with any subsequent disclosure or dissemination of the data. And again, that's something that the Fair Information Practice Act and the regulations provide to be done with respect to, again, this narrower category of information. This would extend it to a broader set of information for the commission's purposes. That's also, by the way, a provision that is included in another statute that we've talked about previously, which is a statute governing personnel records generally. And that statute, I'm paraphrasing here, but it gives an employee the opportunity to submit a statement basically disagreeing with something in a personnel record, and then that statement is supposed to be maintained with the personnel record. But at the same time, in addition to that, the officer would have another opportunity to raise objections with the commission, and that would be by filing a request for further review, and then that would be submitted to the chair, and the chair would then have the ability to decide how to handle it from that point forward. So the chair could put the issue before the commission, or could decide that that's not warranted. But so in other words, this, in short, takes procedures that are available generally and made mandatory to a series of state government agencies and applies them to a broader set of information for purposes of the commission's data and data affecting law enforcement officers. If you wouldn't mind scrolling down. Then there are just some adjustments made to account for the inclusion of that new section. And so that's the end. If the final reference is just, that's a reference to the regulation that allows us to supersede that very regulation. So if there are questions, I can answer them, and I'm sorry for some of the technical difficulties.
Commissioner West, please.
Thank you, Chair. Randy, thank you. This is an incredibly important area for us, and I recognize the significant amount of work that's gone into it. I think I'm probably just missing this, that what you just spoke about, 8.07, and I don't know if it makes sense to put this back up, but let me tell you my question. You said that this language that we have basically broadens an officer's ability to challenge the material that's going out. And is there particular language in here that does it? Is it under section 1? Like, what part of this language does actually that?
Well, what I mean by that is that right now under the Fair Information Practice Act and the regulations promulgated by ANF that currently govern the commission, an individual would have a procedure that's very similar to what you see here. They would have that procedure for challenging information within an agency's database, provided that it falls within that definition of personal data. And that definition of personal data excludes public record, it excludes query, it excludes certain other categories, specifically evaluative information and investigative information. So if there's any data that's particularly private and that deals with an individual, that individual has the opportunity to raise objections to the agency regarding the accuracy of that data, or whether it should be included, whether it's complete. So what I'm saying is this regulation basically it's modeled after that regulation. But it applies it not just to that narrow category of personal data that excludes all those other things. It applies it really to any data involving the individual that would be maintained by the commission. So if Mr. Director, I don't know if you're well, it's if you're able to scroll down to the end notes, to the very end of the document. Okay,
I don't think this one has it.
Okay, that's right. The regulations that I'm referring to are substantively these are patterned after those. It's just that it applies those to again a wider category of data.
Okay, thank you, Randy. I understand, and I can see the end notes. So you're saying by us not adopting, by not being subjected to the Fair Information Act and producing our own regulation within this agency, it's a broader area where an officer can object.
Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Bluestone. I think your hand was in the air next.
Yes, thanks again, Attorney Ravitz. And I think this is a really important addition to provide an opportunity for objections to be raised. My question is whether in CMR 8.07, 1 through 5, it allows the person in the role of the executive director to unilaterally remove data from the database without the commission being aware of that removal.
Well, it gives the executive director or that person's designee some discretion with respect to matters that are. I'm sorry. Are you referring to the? Okay.
Removal of data.
I see. It would give that that person, the executive director, at the outset, the ability to make a change if the executive director finds that change to be warranted. It doesn't expressly provide that the commission would be notified of that change. That could be added, or it could be something that that is just done as a matter of practice.
I would request just in light of potential future concerns about how that what kinds of issues might come up around one person having the ability to remove data without any balance around that issue, that we put a statement in there that requires that information to be disseminated.
Disseminated to the commission is that
to the commission, so that it's not on the shoulders of one individual.
Thank you. Randy, do you want to respond to that before we turn to Commissioner Calderon?
No, I think that there could be something added to that effect if the commission wants that change.
I don't know what I did with this version, but I think, Commissioner, you're talking about the inclusion of this word dissemination of data. Is that correct?
Well, if I'm understanding this correctly, I think my concern is that it allows the person or designee to remove data from a database. And so there's sort of a balance here of, I think, being supportive and discreet around individual requests for review of data, but also the public's interest in having a database that is fully representative of the issues. And so if one person is allowed to remove data from that database without other people on the commission being aware of that, I would have a concern about that.
Yep.
Anything else related to that particular issue before I turn to Commissioner Calderon, who may well have something relating to that issue to address? Commissioner Calderon, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, I have nothing more on that point. I think everybody understood what Commissioner Bluestone was saying and the executive director's reply. I'm going to jump right to 8.5, section 4, I believe, excuse me, section 10. If we, I had it right the first time. If we go to 8.5, section 4, all the way down to number 10 on page 3. Yeah, you just had it. Yeah, right there. The summary. Sorry. Yep. Right there. The summary of the officer's disciplinary record based on information. It says excluding unsustained or unfounded complaints. Will there be something in the record on officers' exoneration of any such complaints?
Yes, Commissioner, we can assume that it's not expressly in the regulations, but we can assume that the summary has all these positions, including exonerations.
If it's possible and agreed upon by everybody, Mr. Director, if we could put in the exonerations as well in writing, unfortunately, my experience, at least, my experience has led me to witness that certain agencies will send over the information that they feel pertinent to send over. And I feel very strongly that if we're going to put that public record out, that the public should know any exonerations for any would-be complaints that are being sent over. They should know that an officer was exonerated on it. And we should not leave that just to the departments to decide what they're going to send and not send. That's my first one, if that's acceptable to everybody. If we could go over to
Commissioner Calderon, could we?
Yes.
Just because Commissioner Kazarosian, I think, has had her hand in there on this issue, may I turn to her just on this?
Of course.
We'll
Absolutely.
come back to you on your second point, please.
Please, yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Just on what you had just suggested, Commissioner Calderon, I always am worried about adding things and then thinking maybe we should have added something else. So if we are going to do something like add the language that includes the exonerations, I'd just rather have it say something to the effect of including but not limited to, because I don't want to start adding specific things, which sounds like it may be excluding other specific things. And that's the only point I wanted to make.
I have no issue with that. Thank you. Yeah.
And then Commissioner Calderon, I think you had at least one other issue you wanted to raise.
Two more, and I think they're brief, similar to this. If we go over to page 5, 8.5, section 7. And we go down to letter D, it talks about the point at which all entities that the commission knows to have been investigating.
Is it here, Commissioner?
Yes, that's the one. Yes. I could be confused on it, but it talks about knows have been investigated, man, I have not decided to pursue. My point that I'm trying to make, or my question is there such thing as an unreasonable amount of time that passes before something has been decided not to be pursued? And I ask that because here in Boston, we seem to have a situation that I know that the current mayor has publicly tried to tackle about how long does it take for internal affairs to actually come to a decision on are they going to pursue something? We have individual officers that unfortunately wait years to hear about a complaint, and that's totally unacceptable for anybody to have to deal with. Is there a time frame that this commission or the body can agree to put in there as to what's reasonable and what's not? I know there's all kinds of discussions about 90 days, 180 days. I believe our current post law dictates 1 year it should be completed by. Do we have thoughts on that? Because I'd like to know what unreasonable is.
And I think Commissioner Ellison, I think may want to respond or address that particular issue also.
Well, just similar to that, I just, because as I was thinking about this, because I know we're trying to format something that fits all departments, but not understanding how others operate. And maybe Chief Nguyen, Commissioner Nguyen can help me out on this. For instance, I'm going to use Boston because I'm familiar with it. Is that if you're issued an oral reprimand, that is written in your folder, but you have no course of appeal to that. But that will show up unfavorable in an officer's record, and they've had no way of challenging that. And just if that's going to be looked at in there, that there needs to be some explanation that this is something that the officers are not able to challenge or appeal an oral reprimand, but it's in a written format in their file. And I'm not sure if Chief Nguyen in his town operates in the same manner, and this may be across the board.
I can only speak for my agency because I don't have familiarity with the procedures, but that is not my understanding of the current personnel law. If it goes in the personnel file, the individual has the right to file a written response. So oral reprimands that are documented, they still get to respond to. Oral reprimands that are held at the supervisory level, they may not.
See. Thank you. And that explanation is not in the folder, and it's not everyone is not aware that you can't challenge that here in Boston. If you get an oral reprimand, you basically have to live with it, but it goes in your personnel file with no real explanation from the officer.
Commissioner Ellison, I don't know how this intersects with your point, but you'll remember there's in our phase 1 regulations for submitting complaints to the commission, there's the exclusion of certain complaints that are not reportable to the commission. And I will point commissioners that that's not intended to be, of course, published if they're not reportable to us. These regulations would provide for us not to publish those associated to each officer.
Thank you.
Are there other?
I have one more.
Yes, Commissioner Calderon, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have one more. Executive Director, thanks for clearing that up. I was going to ask that same question right after we were done. I didn't think the oral reprimands were coming over. Last thing that I have is on page 7 at the top of our page, which should be still 8.7 that we're talking about. Subsection 8 talks about if the commission has good faith, reasonable belief of a public employee.
Is it 8.806 you said, Commissioner, or 807?
It on the corrected version, it's 807.
Okay.
And it should have on my page, it has a red line 6 and a new subsection 8. If you keep going, I'll stop you when you right there. If the commission receives, oh, I'm sorry. Nope, that's not it. Nope.
Yeah. I think it's just above.
It's just above.
Yes.
Yeah, there we go. That's it right there. If the commission has good faith, reasonable belief, etc. It says that the commission. Let me just read it, make sure I say this right, because that's the right to be corrected. So it says that the commission can make reasonable efforts to give the employee an opportunity to exercise the right to have its record corrected or expunged. Do I read that correctly, that whatever decision is made at the executive director level or at the chair's level will then be shared with the commission so that we'd be able to make an appropriate judgment? Will we know everything that has been decided at the executive director or chair level to afford the person the opportunity to have the commission vote on that, or am I misunderstanding it?
I can respond to that if that's right. That section is a little bit different than the ones above in that it's referring to this the statute that's cited there, which governs personnel records. So really records maintained by the employer. So what it's providing is that if we know that there's information in the employer's personnel record that could be inaccurate, we want to give the employee, the officer, the ability to exercise the rights that the officer has to correct that information in the employer's records before we do anything with it. So does that answer the question?
Perfectly clear. Thank you, Randy. I misunderstood exactly what it was talking about, but that makes perfect sense. If we find something in our personnel folder, we can appeal to the commission. Nope, that's great. I appreciate the time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Let me make sure there are no other questions or comments that we've not addressed. Don't think I see any hands in the air. And I think at this point, commissioners, I think we had intended to seek a vote on this today, this being, I think, at least the second time we've addressed it. I guess my question is, are we ready for a vote or?
Madam Chair, if I may, there was the concern that Commissioner Bluestone brought up that we would not have drafted yet on this document. We could do it right now, or and that is the fact of allowing only the executive director or their designee to remove data. If you wanted to try to address that now, we could do that.
Let me hear, I think I have two people who want to speak to that issue. Commissioner West, I think first, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was going to say the same thing. That is the outstanding issue. I agree with Commissioner Bluestone that we should address it. But by adding language to Section 3, I'm not sure that we can address this right now, and Randy would know better, but I think if you require the executive director to notify the commission of material that he believes should be removed, then it seems to me then there's got to be another step. And I may be wrong about that, and I'm interested to know if anyone has suggested language.
Excuse me, I have no suggested language, but I have to get off the call. I apologize. So I'm going to have to sign out.
And Commissioner Kazarosian, we will miss your continued participation in the meeting. Frankly, as chair, I think in light of what has just been raised, in light of the response that was made by Commissioner West just now, I would suggest that we defer any vote on this and we redraft and can take up a vote at our next meeting. Is there anyone who objects to that procedure? Anyone who wishes to call for, anyone who objects to? And I think with that, Randy, we leave to you the redrafting and consideration of the issues that have been raised here. And then we will take this up and be prepared to have a vote on it at our October meeting. Any other issues with regard to this? I think we still have a quorum, so we will continue without Commissioner Keserosian and move to the next item on the agenda. Mindful of our timing, may I just ask Attorney Ravitz whether there of the remaining issues under item 4, which is the next one that we need to address today, in your view?
The one that's very next, which is the approval of what were originally promulgated as emergency recertification regulations as permanent regulations.
All right. And that is item 4B, correct? In the agenda?
I
think so, Madam Chair. I can share my screen so that people can see that. Randy?
Yes. This document hopefully will be seen as straightforward. It essentially lays out the events occurring in the process of promulgating what are now found at 555 CMR 7.00. So in other words, the commission's emergency recertification regulations. It goes through the steps involved in promulgating those and the steps that have happened since then that are consistent with what the law requires in order to make a set of emergency regulations permanent. And then it asks the commission to approve making those regulations permanent and authorizing the staff to take the steps necessary to do that. I think it's fair to say that we've seen these regulations working well in practice. It's not meant to imply that in the future there wouldn't be ideas for how they could be further improved upon, but generally speaking, they've been working well in practice. Mr. Executive Director, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think it's well said. They've been working well. It was great to have the strength of the regulation to rely on for the implementation of all those recertification efforts. And because we promulgated them by emergency, we need to take this step to make them permanent.
Thank you. Questions or comments from my fellow commissioners? And on this one, I don't think I see any hands in the air. Let me then ask for a motion to approve the recertification regulations on a permanent basis. Is there?
I move to approve the recertification regulations on a permanent basis.
Thank you. Is there a second to that motion?
I second.
All right. Let me call for the vote, please. Dr. Bluestone,
I approve.
Commissioner Calderon,
Yes.
Commissioner Sherry,
Yes.
Commissioner Ellison,
Yes.
Commissioner Luma,
Approved.
Commissioner West,
Approved.
and Commissioner Wynn.
Yes.
I also approve. All commissioners in attendance unanimously approve. And with that, let me ask again of our general counsel with regard to the 2 remaining issues. Should we simply move on to the certification of Humane Society officers at this point?
Yes, it would be convenient to take that up.
Thank you.
And
So item 4C.
I'll share my screen again, Randy.
thank you. I appreciate that very much. And if you wouldn't mind, once it's up, scrolling down to section 3 that states approval. Okay. All right. I will briefly summarize everything that appears above that point. The legislature recently added humane societies and their officers to the definitions of law enforcement agency and law enforcement officer respectively within Chapter 6E. And it added a reference to the need to be certified within the section of Chapter 22C that concerns special state police officers for humane societies. And it made the change retroactive to July 1st, 2022. Humane societies are societies such as the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and the Animal Rescue League of Boston. I highlight those in particular because they utilize SSPOs, they have officers, but it's organizations of that type. And what the legislature did not do, however, in the recent amendments is that it did not automatically certify those officers for a period of time or provide for any type of grace period, similar to what it did with most officers generally in the 2020 legislation. So that essentially created a situation where this set of officers was not only immediately, but retroactively subject to all the rules of Chapter 6E, including the requirement that they could not be appointed or employed by a law enforcement agency unless they're certified. But there really was not the time or the opportunity for them to get certified before that happened. Again, it even took place retroactively. So what this proposal would do is three things. In subsection A, it provides a way for those officers to obtain temporary conditional certification through a summary application process if they have not, if they don't have full applications ready for filing. Most of them actually have filed them and they've already been processed, but this provides just a little extra coverage in case under the circumstances they were not able to get full applications ready. And it calls for the agency head to submit an attestation that the statutory requirements have been met. So in other words, if the agency head is convinced that that's the case, but it's just a matter of getting the paperwork together, this would provide a temporary conditional certification. Then scrolling down to subsection B, that allows for conditional certification of an officer who's been unable to meet training requirements due to a documented hardship. And it essentially tracks the policy that the commission previously adopted in the recertification context. So in other words, if somebody was unable to meet training requirements because they were on military leave or because they were on parental leave, it would provide them with an extension of time, generally granting them an extension until 90 days after they return to active service. And the only reason that needed to be added was because when it was previously adopted by the commission, again, it was in the context of recertification, and technically speaking, these people are not being recertified, they're being certified brand new. And then subsection C allows for the certification of this group of officers to be made retroactive to July 1st, 2022 for the reasons that I stated. The term Humane Society officer is defined as including only this current group. So it's not as though in the future, new people who are hired, their certifications would not be made retroactive. It's only this group. And then finally, subsections D and E just make clear that agencies can still submit full applications if they don't have to go through that summary procedure. That the commission can still grant full certifications. It doesn't have to condition things. It can still condition things or restrict them when warranted, and it can still revise or withdraw disapproval at any time. So it's basically a reservation of rights type section. So with that, I would ask if the chair is amenable to it. I'd be happy to entertain any questions, and then would hope that the commission could take a vote on this.
Are there any questions or comments? Yes, Commissioner Wynn, please.
Good morning again. No questions, but I do want to comment. This issue has been pending for as long as we've been meeting as a commission. I would say I've gotten more calls on this from colleagues who work in this sphere, who were concerned that they were not going to be able to obtain certification. And I just want to say that, in my opinion, having done work with the MSPCA and sometimes with the animal rescue, this is incredibly important. People who work outside of law enforcement may not understand that in addition to the things we think about with animal cruelty and animal abuse, These investigators and their teams provide incredible investigative resources in support of intimate partner violence cases, arson cases, and other serious crimes of violence. We need to protect and cover these officers.
Thank you. And Commissioner Luma, please.
Attorney Ravitz, can you just clarify that last section that you reviewed in regards to certification being retroactive? You're saying you mentioned that new employees would not necessarily be covered, right? Is that what you said?
Oh, okay. What I meant there was that that section allows for the commission to make any of these certifications for this group of people retroactive to July 1st. So again, this is the group of people who basically were caught in this situation where on July 28th, the legislature said, since July 1st, you've been subject to a requirement stating that you can't be appointed or employed unless you're certified. And of course, they hadn't been certified, nor would we have had the power to certify them until that point. So this allows for the certification of those people to be retroactive. But because it uses the term Humane Society Officer, and up above, Humane Society Officer is defined as just being limited to, this group of current people. I just wanted to be clear that it's not as though this is saying that, if somebody is hired next year by one of these organizations, that the commission can make their certification retroactive to July 1st, 2022. It's only for this special group of people that were caught in this situation and have actually already been employed that it allows for retroactivity. Is that?
And are we, is this specific to those individuals with A through H? Are we using the same format, procedures?
That provision of the 2020 session law that divided things up into thirds based on the alphabet, that applied to people who were automatically certified at that time. But the legislature didn't include anything like that in the amendments for this new group of people. So with respect to this new group of people, we're really looking at everyone, A through Z. Now it's a small group of people. It's only 11 people, but and it's not. It's a group that we're able to process, but it's just a matter of covering all of them to make sure that, for example, nobody says, well, you weren't certified properly during this period of time, when we all know that they're just caught in an unusual situation.
Okay, so just for clarification, it includes the entire group.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner West.
If I understand correctly, this is just putting this limited group of people in the same position that the legislature put all the other officers in at the start. They just didn't include the same language for this group, right?
Yes.
So I think this is a no-brainer, because otherwise we would not be treating them equally if we didn't do this.
Right.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Commissioner Wynn, please, again.
Just to respond really quickly to Commissioner West, because it was, in my opinion, it was more than a simple oversight. These two organizations in particular were specifically put on the out of scope list. We went through an evaluative process and they didn't fit in the authority we had at the time. We needed the legislative amendment, and now we have to accept them.
Thank you. Anything else from any of the commissioners? If not, let me call for a motion to approve the certification of the Humane Society officers. Is there such a motion?
So moved.
So moved.
I'll second.
Thank you. Let me call for a vote. Commissioner Bluestone,
Approve.
Commissioner Calderon,
Yes, approve.
Commissioner Cherry,
Yes.
Commissioner Ellison,
Approved.
Commissioner Luma,
Approved.
Commissioner West,
Approved.
Commissioner Wynn.
Approved.
I also approve, unanimously carried by those in attendance. Thank you all for your comments, and Randy, thanks for your effort in drafting this document. I think we have one other issue to address today. Item number 4D, the draft regulations for certification of school resource officers.
Okay, I will attempt to share my screen on that. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, by way of background, Chapter 6E, our governing statute, in Section 3B, provides that the commission shall have the power to issue a specialized certification for an individual acting or intending to act as a school resource officer, as it's defined in another statute, Section 37P of Chapter 71, provided that a person shall not be appointed to such a role as a school resource officer as defined, unless they're specifically certified as such by the commission. So it requires, essentially requires there to be some type of a certification process in place in order for there to be school resource officers. However, the statute does not elaborate on the standards for certification or the procedures for certification. So it's very different in that respect than other parts of the statute, which elaborate to a great extent on what is required for certification. However, it does make reference to this other statute, Chapter 71, Section 37P. And that statute is actually very extensive in setting forth requirements and restrictions regarding the appointment and the activity and the supervision of school resource officers. It also requires a municipality to adopt a set of operating procedures that need to have certain characteristics. It requires them to adopt an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, based on a model that had to be developed and was developed by a special commission created by the legislature. And then there's another statute, Chapter 6, Section 116, that requires the MPTC to develop a training program for SROs. And it has to cover 8 different topics, and it has to be developed in consultation with experts in several areas. And then there's even another statute and regulations that don't specifically refer to school resource officers, but they provide special requirements for background checks for people who work in schools. So while the Chapter 6E is very limited in what it tells us as far as school resource officers and certification, there are very extensive provisions in other parts of the general laws. So in these draft regulations, and that was just by way of the background, but in these draft regulations, the term SRO certification refers to this type of specialized certification that's provided for in Section 3B, and the term officer certification refers to ordinary certification as a law enforcement officer under Section 4, the type that we've been dealing with mainly. Just scrolling down through the definition section, getting to the heart of it, sections 1004, 1 and 2 provide relatively basic administrative procedures. They provide for the development of an application form that calls for several types of information to be provided, and the setting of an application deadline for those who are currently serving as SROs. Subsection 3 spells out what needs to be included in that application. And it says that the application needs to include submission of an endorsement by the appointing authority. So in other words, the officer who's seeking to be an SRO has to have the backing of their appointing authority. It needs to include the SRO operating procedures and the MOU that I mentioned, both of which are, again, discussed in that separate section, Section 37P of Chapter 71. It needs to include information on the extent to which the officer has completed the special SRO training required by the MPTC, and the extent to which they've completed in-service training and any retraining that they were ordered to do. And it needs to include, or at least not necessarily in the application, but the applicant needs to cause to be provided to the commission the results of a background check that's consistent with those provisions dealing with people who serve in schools. Then Section 10.05 moves on to what the the Division of Certification does with all that information. It allows the division to supplement it with additional information, most of which are types of information that are referenced in the recertification regulations for ordinary officer certification. It adds the possibility of getting letters of reference or names of additional references. And then it goes on to talk about how the division would evaluate all of this. And it says that the division can grant an SRO certification where the individual possesses an officer certification. So in other words, ordinary certification, which also ensures that the individual has satisfied all those requirements, and provided that the division has received no information suggesting that they would now be ineligible, in other words, that they would no longer satisfy those requirements, that there would have to be a sufficient MOU and sufficient operating procedures. Again, those documents that are spelled out in that other statute, section 37P, that the individual has passed one of those school-oriented background checks, that the individual has completed the required SRO training, and that they've completed any other in-service training or retraining that was required. And then the section goes on to round out the administrative aspects through steps that are similar to what's provided for in the recertification context. Now, I wanted to flag another option, another possibility, and that would be to eliminate the requirements that there be a sufficient MOU and sufficient operating procedures. And that would be on the idea that certification of an SRO should just focus on that person and their own personal characteristics, and not on the quality of the agreements between them and the school that they would be working in, especially when that could change. Either those requirements could change, or they could move to a different school, and so it would basically leave the evaluation of the sufficiency of those documents for other agencies, and in particular, section 37P that discusses those documents is primarily administered by two other agencies, EOPS and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So in other words, when we look at certification of an individual, we wouldn't look at the sufficiency of those documents. We would just look at things that were more personal to the individual being considered. Section 1006 would require, it deals with conditional certification, and it would require the imposition of any conditions that are attached to the individual's officer certification, so the ordinary certification. Those would need to basically carry over, and that the division not only may, but shall require, attach any other conditions that it deems warranted. And it would provide that the division could grant a certification to someone who satisfied all the conditions except for the training requirements, but on a conditional basis. And then it rounds out the terms of conditional certifications in ways that resemble the terms that are found in the recertification regulations. Then reaching the end, this section 1007 provides for review by the executive director and through a hearing in terms that resemble those in the recertification regulations. And then section 1008 at the end includes a number of general provisions that resemble those found in the recertification regulations. So it provides that a certification does not expire while the renewal process is ongoing, that it could always be limited, that it could be granted retroactively, that it lasts for 3 years, that if it is ultimately vacated, it will still be deemed valid until the point of the vacation order. And it further provides that an SRO certification decision does not affect officer certification. So in other words, those two things are separate. If the person does not get SRO certification, that doesn't necessarily mean that they lose their officer certification. That needs to be handled through its own procedures. But if a person's officer certification, the regular certification, has been revoked or suspended, then their SRO certification would also be revoked or suspended. And then finally, it provides that if an individual's SRO certification is suspended or revoked, or the individual otherwise does not possess an SRO certification, the individual shall not serve as an SRO. And that's generally consistent with section 3B, which says they can't be appointed as an SRO without being certified. Why did I boldface and underline and capitalize the word not? Because I inadvertently omitted it in the draft that was circulated. So I just added that as an addition. And I can answer any questions that anyone may have.
Yes, and Randy, I have several, if Madam Chair, if you don't mind.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So the first one being, you're right, on the MOU, like here in Boston, we're the only city that does not have an MOU currently. And in fact, we've had all the training, and I work in the school unit, but we haven't, there's still some misunderstanding on what the operation. So I think actually removing that would be helpful in allowing the work to be done once the training has been completed and they've met the criteria and the training that the MPTC has put out. The other piece to that as well is that Boston is totally unique in that we don't have officers that are assigned in buildings like most other cities and towns do. And we also have officers who don't work in a full-time capacity working with kids. And there's some gray area on whether or not they need to be certified to go in the schools periodically. For instance, they go in to do a presentation. Do they need to be certified by MPTC and have the exact training as an SRO to be inside the building?
I think that I appreciate those comments, and that one of your comments, Commissioner, reminds me to point out something else in the document, which is that the document defines the term school resource officer, or SRO, and it borrows the definition that's contained in Chapter 71, Section 37P, which is what our statute at Section 3B says to do. However, looking at that definition, there's some room for interpretation in terms of how things are categorized. And so this essentially provides that interpretation through things like these subsections and punctuation. But of significance here is that it provides, it reads that definition, and I think that this is the best reading to say that somebody is an SRO if they're appointed by the chief of police and charged, if they're charged with performing all of these duties. So what that would mean is that if somebody is not charged with performing all of those duties, but they are just on an occasional basis called into a school to deal with a particular situation that arises, they would not fall under that part of the definition. And I think that reading of the statute, which again, I think is the best reading, would also go a long way towards answering a lot of the questions that have been raised that you were referring to about whether somebody would need to comply with all the rules regarding SROs if they just happen to be called into a school for isolated reasons, but they're not charged with performing all of those duties.
Right. If maybe if we could spell that out in there, because people are very hesitant because they think they're violating the spirit of the law by doing that even on those occasions. So if that could be incorporated in the language, explaining that if they're not full-time SROs, that they wouldn't be governed under the same standard as someone who is.
I think that could be made explicit if others don't object.
It would be extremely helpful because there's a lot of back and forth and it depends on who shows up as to whether or not you can go in the building, as simple as reading a book. If you're violating the rules on the law as it stands, if you're not an SRO, that you can't do these things. I know it sounds simple, but people are
Yeah.
hesitant about doing it.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellison, and thank you, Randy, for your work in drafting this. Are there other questions or comments from my fellow commissioners today? And if not, Randy, the procedure for commissioners to communicate with you post the meeting today and or members of the public with regard to this draft, which I think is the first time we've addressed it, right? Would be what?
They can send me an email, randall.e.ravitz@mass.gov. And to the extent that people have ideas for changes, and they can redline the document and offer the language that they think is preferable, that would be the most helpful.
Thank you. Anything else with regard to this particular agenda item to address today? Don't think I see any hands in the air on that one. I think with that, we have completed, have we not, everything that's been on the agenda today. With regard to item number 5, matters not anticipated by the chair at the time of posting, I don't know of any. And so I think with that, unless there are any other questions or comments from anybody in attendance, let me seek a motion to adjourn.
I'll make the motion.
Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Commissioner Bluestone,
Approve.
Commissioner Calderon,
Yes.
Commissioner Sherry,
Yes.
Commissioner Ellison,
Approved.
Commissioner Luma,
Yes.
Commissioner West,
Yes.
Commissioner Wynn.
Yes.
I also approve. The motion is unanimously carried. Let me thank everyone in attendance today for participating in this meeting. Let me thank our staff for their incredibly thorough and diligent work with regard to all of the items that we have addressed and all of the items that the commission is currently dealing with. With that, I think we will conclude this meeting.
Good day, everyone.
Thank you.